Okay, I guess we'll have to get started. DeWitt isn't here, so we'll just have to go with the panelists we have. So good afternoon and welcome to OU Library's 2022 African American Celebration event, Race Relations in Metro Detroit, Past Decades to Present Day, a panel discussion. I'm Ann Zacharias, Outreach and Social Sciences Librarian, and I'm privileged to introduce today's moderator, Mr. Omar Brownell. Mr. Brownell has been Senior Director of OU's Center for Multicultural Initiatives for 19 years. He's a campus leader and has made a career out of student success. Omar?
Thank you, Anne, for having me for today's panel discussion. And thank you to yourself as well as the Kresge Library for hosting such an important topic, race relations in Metro Detroit, past decades to present day. I have the honor of facilitating and moderating this discussion. So I think what we're going to do is allow folks to engage with us during this panel discussion. So if you're joining us today, please feel free to utilize the chat feature, and Anne will be assisting me with those questions that are coming from the chat. Also, if you are not presenting, we ask that you remain on mute so as to not interrupt our panelists as they're providing responses to the questions. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our two panelists that are with us today, starting with Professor David Goldberg, who is a professor at Wayne State University in the African American Studies Department. Also joining us today, Professor Graham Cassano from OU Sociology Department with a research focus on urban sociology theory, labor history, mass media, race, gender, and class. Thank you both for joining us today. I'm going to start with our first question, knowing that everything is to your response. We have a limited time here today, so just be mindful to our visitors who are joining us today. I'll start with the first question. How would you describe the state of race relations in Metro Detroit? What do you see as the most glaring current problems facing Metro Detroiters in terms of race?
I guess I'll start on that. You know, traditionally, Detroit and the metro area have had a seeming divide between the city and the suburbs, hence movies like 8 Mile. But the racial geography of the metropolitan area has changed a bit, right? You have at least over half the Black population now living in inner ring suburbs, as well as in the city. And so some of the dynamics are quite different than like 1960s, for example. Yet I would argue to you that many of the same factors that were in play that led to the rebellion in 1967 are even worse today. So I would say to you in many ways that race relations are worse today than they had been back during the urban rebellion of 1967. And I think that's important for us to point out, especially with all the press that the city gets about how things are turning around. That's true for some people, but certainly not for many residents, not only in the city, but also in those inner ring suburbs. I'll stop there and listen to Graham's comments.
So in a sense, I thought of myself as a kind of supplementary panelist, since my area is really Pontiac, both as a researcher and as a citizen of Pontiac. So that's one way in which I had considered myself a kind of supplementary scholar in this panel. And, you know, I'm really, as I'm sure we all are, disappointed that we've lost both Watoy and DeWitt as panelists. I think their perspectives were vital, and it makes me feel even more insufficient now that their voices are absent, although I'm very pleased that David's here, and I admire of his work and glad to be on a panel with him. So let me say a couple words about Pontiac to get us started, because I always think of Pontiac as Detroit's forgotten little sister. Our population in Pontiac has certainly declined since its high point in the 1950s. We have about 61,000 people, and it's about 50% Black, about almost 40% white. And then the remaining population is Latinx and Asian by and large. We are economically a struggling city. About 80% of our population has a high school degree or better. About 13% has a bachelor's degree or better. Median household income in Pontiac is about $33,000, where national median household income is closer to $61,000. So in this kind of economic and social context, I talked to the new president of our city council, Mike McGinnis, to kind of get a sense of what he sees as both the challenges and the possibilities for Pontiac in terms of both its economic future and the future of race relations in our town. And, Mike talked about the fact that there've been two really significant migrations out of Pontiac. The first one happened, in the 70s and the 80s, and that was the first kind of massive migration of wealth out of the city. And that was largely, but not entirely, a result of white flight. It was white flight, but also the most privileged Black citizens in terms of their economic wealth tended to leave the city as well in the 70s and 80s. And then between the 1990s and the 2000s, there was a real exodus of the most economically privileged African Americans from our city as well. So residents today are really divided along lines of class and race, in the sense that there's a real sense within Pontiac that some portion of the population is kind of stuck here because they don't have the means to leave. On the other hand, there's a portion of the population that has stayed in Pontiac or come to Pontiac because they see it as representing opportunities in terms of cheap real estate values and that sort of thing. But because of the loss of population, we have an aging infrastructure that costs a lot of money. For Pontiac schools, about 1/3 of the students are English language learners. About 1/3 of the students have learning disabilities, and 100% of the students in Pontiac schools are below the federal poverty line. So, we're really living through the legacy of deindustrialization, and we have been largely forgotten by the state, largely stigmatized by surrounding Oakland County communities. And of course, this resulted in 2011 in Pontiac being placed under emergency management, with our city council being disempowered, with our mayor being disempowered, and with the city's resources essentially sold off and privatized, and the city's public workforce, which was largely African American, decimated. So we are in a position economically of real distress. And that economic distress, I think, has only exacerbated already difficult race relations, and the legacy of white supremacy in our city continues to shape residential patterns, so that there still continue to be neighborhoods that are largely white and neighborhoods that are largely Black, despite the open housing movement and despite 40 years of attempts at neighborhood integration. So those are the divides that run through Pontiac at the moment.
I could just quickly follow up on that before we
Sure.
go on. Because of course the situations are parallel, right? We saw when emergency management was introduced in the state, as every place with the Black majority was placed under emergency management,
Yeah.
right? Which forced city governments to kind of lose whatever kind of authority they had in negotiations. So when Detroit went bankrupt, just to give you an example, they brought in a bankruptcy attorney, Kevin Orr, from the largest international law firm. Many of the people on it representing Trump clients now. And in the process of that, somebody who's not from the city, who does not have to run for re-election, could then introduce things that had no business being in a municipal bankruptcy. The water department being primary to that, but also the DIA. Those had no business being in there, and it was done by Kevin Orr to make it seem like there was some substantial deal. And to your point about the state and the role that the state played, this is kind of critical when thinking about emergency management in Flint and Pontiac and Benton Harbor and Detroit, is that the state in many ways facilitated bankruptcy by cutting funding and revenue sharing to each spot. And just to your point, and what the conditions that created, right, was this calling for then so-called business people and philanthropists to come in and do the work of the city government, right, through privatization, as you mentioned. Let me turn that off before my kids' friends bother me. Excuse me for that. So you have this push towards privatization. In the process of it, and the state involvement in trying to entice business through tax incentives and various devices, locally through TIFs or tax incremental financing. We now have a situation in which the poorest residents in the city of Detroit are basically funding tax breaks for people like Dan Gilbert, Mike Ilitch, right? So all the things that we celebrate in the media about downtown being so great, those taxes are captured and never trickle anywhere. And the result of that is that our population, which has a 49% adult illiteracy rate, huge rates of child poverty, right, are being forced to pay for the wealthy to become wealthier.
Yeah.
Thank you both for those responses. Listening to what you've just described, I think I heard earlier, David, that you said that things are worse today than they were before. And hearing Graham explain, about the means and resources, leaving the city. Talk to me about how do you see the race relations? Is it more an economic distress, or is there still a lack of understanding between races? Is this an educational component? What do we see as the emphasis behind it in terms of being in the place where we see it today compared to the years before where you've described?
Well, I'd like to begin with residential segregation, and I'll let David speak to this as well, but this is certainly what we see in Oakland County, right? And Wayne County, I think, you can look at the racial dot maps of Detroit and look at 8 Mile, and you see one side of 8 Mile, some portion of a Black population, and on the other side, it becomes all white. And you look at the same thing in the communities around Pontiac, where there's a very clear residential segregation that still exists in our country. It's, as some people say, a de facto segregation rather than de jure. It's not enforced by law, but it certainly exists. And if you're going to have any kind of communication and interchange between different racial groups, one of the first things you have to do is begin to break down the racial and what goes with that, the educational segregation that separates different racial groups in our society. And in Southeastern Michigan, especially Black folks and white folks, but it's not just a Black and white problem, obviously.
Yeah, I guess, and I don't mean to be disrespectful to anybody that put this panel together, but I guess fundamentally my problem would be with the term race relations in and of itself. It's a very kind of liberal, Gunnar Myrdalian term, for lack of a better word, that race relations is about changing hearts and minds, right? So black and white people could get along. We're talking about, in my estimation, what we're really saying when we're saying race relations is we're talking about racism. We're talking about power relations and structural racism. Yet if we say it like it's just race relations, then it seems like everybody has equal skin in the game and equal responsibilities, right? And that's not the truth, right? You have a group of people that are in power that are predominantly white and sometimes deploy members of the black middle class to their advantage, right? But what we're really dealing with is an unequal power dynamic, right? Whites generally holding that power and blacks being kept from it. We see that today in attempts to kind of manipulate elections and things of this nature. But to your point, and education is critical to kind of these imbalances, right? And education at one point, because it was based on property tax values, was deeply related to residential segregation, right? Pontiac knows this, right? This is how L. Brooks Patterson got his start, defending the white supremacists in Pontiac, right? Later to then gain political power over the whole county, the wealthiest county in Michigan, right? I think it was like at one point, I used to hear this growing up, second wealthiest county in the United States. I don't know if that was true or not, but people used to say it all the time, right? And that had to deal with kind of like conflicts over sharing resources for education with Black children, right? Milliken versus Bradley, and then, the Bradley versus Milliken, and then Milliken versus Bradley made it so that they could contain the threat, right, of having to share resources by relegating it to local municipalities, right? So that's a power dynamic and a policy dynamic that Black people didn't necessarily have influence in other than from the outside through pressure, right? Grassroots pressure and protest, right? And we have racial segregation today, it just has slightly of a different form, right? So if you look on the border of 8 Mile today, we have Black majority suburbs now, right? Half of Warren is predominantly Black, right? They're holding the line right around 696, but half of Warren is Black. East Point is now majority Black. Harper Woods, Redford Union, right? That whole area, Southfield is predominantly Black, right? So some of the dynamics of this have changed. But what's really different is that those people no longer are in the city in many ways because they can't afford it. And this is kind of important to note that people are moving to the suburbs because they can't afford to live in the cities because of the legacy taxes and bonds left behind. I always use this analogy in my classes, but I think it's apt. Detroit was at its peak growth in 1950, roughly 2 million people, about 1.8 million people. And we took out bonds to build up all the infrastructure for the city. And then people started leaving right around that time. So in effect, you built up a city and left before paying the bill. It's like going to a restaurant, ordering 4 meals for yourself, and then walking out and leaving whoever's there behind to pay for it. And of course, the people that were there left behind couldn't pay for it because the economy was shifting. They were the first victims of the first process of deindustrialization in the 50s, right, that got rid of unskilled jobs. And then you had a slight boom in the 60s because of production increased around 63 to 71. And then the cities were left behind by disinvestment from companies, right? So all the automobile companies by this point had damn near moved out except Chrysler, right? And then they wound up closing Dodge Main in 1981. So it's fundamentally different situation because the poverty rates are incredibly high by the 80s and 90s, right? There's nothing that fills in that void of devastation left by people and companies leaving. So you're dealing with a fundamental kind of issue of poverty that wasn't the same in 1960s. In 1960s, Detroit had the highest number of Black homeowners in the country and the largest Black middle class per capita, right? So the people were left behind having to deal with the fallout of the absence of all these resources. And to make it even worse, the blame was placed on them for what happened in their city, right? Rather than kind of being overtly racial before and saying, well, it fell to pieces because it was Black, right? They said it was a cultural problem, or they said it was a culture of poverty was the language of sociologists at that time, right? But conversely too, it was also placed under the scourge of Black political misleadership, right? So Coleman Young, who was the most fiscally responsible mayor the city of Detroit ever had, the onus was placed on him in a very wrong-handed way, right? It was completely incorrect, but that was the story that was being told, right? And so he even said himself that he was unsuccessful, or not as successful as he wanted to be, but he felt like at the time, because everything that was being taken from the city in terms of resources, his job was just to make sure it didn't go under.
Yeah.
And it's a miracle that he succeeded in doing that. And people paid the price for that miracle because he had to damn near cut everything.
Yeah.
Thank you again. As we're talking about race relations or racism now, since we brought that to the conversation, or power and influence and all of those other factors, giving the topic today, past decades to present day, what sort of things do we see as a continuation in regards to racism that are still prevalent today, and or perhaps some new things that are maybe not as visible, but are presented today in terms of racism, race relations, and that struggle for power or liberty or whatever justice there is? How do we see that in terms of what's carried over and perhaps what is a new way of looking at this?
Well, I think part of what both David and I are pointing to in different ways, which continues, is the immense wealth gap between white Americans and Black Americans. And that wealth gap exists between white Americans and Latinx Americans, white Americans and Asian Americans as well. But it's outrageous between white Americans and Black Americans, where median white wealth for in the United States is over $120,000. And median Black wealth changes from year to year, but it's still below $20,000. That gap is outrageous. It's outrageous. And it's a legacy of white supremacy. Now, I want to be careful here how I use white supremacy, because people use that term in a lot of ways. I'm going to use it in a very specific way, and that is a legal system between 1789 and 1968 that gave white people special rights that other people didn't get. I'm not saying that white supremacy has gone away, but we have a very clear definition of it in that time period, 1789 to 1968. And during that time, white folks especially were given access to resources like private property, like private housing. So I want to just read a line from the deed to my house in Pontiac, which was built in 1923. This indenture, however, is subject to the following restrictions, which run with the land and be binding upon the parties of the second part and their heirs. And then the first restriction: the premises herein described shall not be sold, assigned, leased, or rented to anyone other than a person of the Caucasian race. Right? That's the first line of my deed. Now, of course, that was declared unconstitutional in 1948, but nonetheless, that shaped property relations in my community. That shaped wealth accumulation in my community. So as I often tell my students, if we could snap our fingers, as we all would love to, and make racism go away tomorrow or today, that wealth gap that previous forms of racism gave rise to would continue to exist. So I don't think we can really, quote unquote, even begin to think about how to solve the problem of race relations without focusing on the legacy of white supremacy that gave white folks this tremendous advantage over all other racial groups, but especially over Black folks in the United States.
Yeah, I would echo that. I don't feel like I need to add. I think you said that pretty beautifully. But I do want to kind of get to something like, part of your question was, what kind of are the through lines that kind of still exist, and what is different now? As I mentioned, the kind of spatial geography of kind of like race and space has changed a bit, right? And this is kind of critical because in some ways it has unmoored Black community politics, right? People are far more spread out than they used to be. They're still segregated, but they're segregated in a different way. And they're segregated into smaller municipalities that have less power. And they're disconnected in many ways geographically from one another, which makes it harder to gain traction politically, which I think is important. But just to the point about the through line, let me express one thing that has always been kind of fundamental to implementing racism in Detroit, the metropolitan area, and that's the role of the police, right? We've had this in Detroit, and now I'm going to try and riff on some DeWitt's work. So forgive me if I go back a little bit, but right in 1833, right, we had the Blackburn riot in Detroit, and Black people internationally from Canada and in the city and from the hinterlands and Black towns and places like Cassopolis and even Clare, Michigan, had formed networks, abolitionist networks, Black networks predominantly, right? And there was a person that came with his wife, Blackburn, Lucia and Thornton Blackburn, and they were hunted down by a slave catcher in the city of Detroit. And the Black community in the state of Michigan and in Canada rallied around them to protect them, and ultimately engaged in a riot to secure their release. Famously, Lucy was extracted through nefarious means. This is quite brilliant. Some of her friends came to the jailhouse offering her food, saying they wanted to pray with her. They let her in. She exchanged clothes with one of the women and then snuck out in her clothes. And shortly after, the woman who changed places with her said, "Why am I in here? I'm a free person," right? And they shepherded her over to Canada. But they had to ultimately extract Thornton by getting him out of the hands of the criminal justice system. And they did that by any means necessary. They surrounded the building, they passed him a gun, they rioted, and they secured his liberty, right? Because the police was there to maintain race relations the way that they saw fit at that time, right? And so they had to organize against that. Similarly, in 1863, there's a riot in Detroit, a draft riot, very similar to kind of the one that takes place in New York, a working class riot, largely Irish. People are upset that they now have to go to war. And if they're successful, right, the enslaved will then become free and then become labor competition to them. And so they rioted on the Black community, they attacked their institutions, and they attacked their houses. We have in 1925, right, O.C. Sweet tries to move into a white community. A mob, including members of the Klan and neighborhoods associations, which couldn't be cleaved from the Klan, right, attack him. He defends his own house and he miraculously kind of gets out of it, is acquitted. But he doesn't really get out of it because in that process of that entire event of him being attacked, and he was one of like 5 people who had their Black people who purchased homes that were kicked out by mobs, right? He lost his wife and his youngest daughter in the process of that. I'm mentioning all these things because, and then in 1943, of course, the race riot, right? People are being pulled off trolleys and beaten, led by the police. Police kill 17 people in 1943, right? All the people that they killed were Black. Counts were that they were leading the mob, right? Just to kind of take it back a little bit, in 1925, the same year as O.C. Sweet, right? The police in 9 months shot 55 Black Detroiters, right? Same thing with 1967. You know, we only know about 67, most of us, right? Some of us may have heard about 43, but you have to ask yourself, why don't we hear about all these other events of white racial violence against the Black population as a means to contain them, right? People have memories about 1967 and its meaning. You know, I do a similar exercise. You talked about, you know, your deed and the restrictive covenant on it. I used to have students, I'm getting a little too old for this now, but I used to have students and I'd say, ask me, you know, tell me when your parents moved, you know, out of the city. And all of them were told that they moved after the rebellion, right? And then I'd have them go through their family's paperwork and it turned out like 8 out of 10 times the people had moved earlier, right? So white people had used this event as a memory for something, and they weren't really the people under attack. The people that were under attack, people rather than businesses, but the people under attack during 1967 were Black people in the middle of the city, right? They died at a disproportionate rate during this event and had been under attack by the police, right? And we still see this to this day. I work with people in a group called Detroit Will Breathe, some of whom attended Oakland University that I know are very courageous people. And one thing that is a bit different now is that when we have these struggles in the city, we have these struggles on an interracial basis to a level that didn't exist prior. Now, the left used to organize here in the 70s interracially, and it was big and bigger than it is now. But since that time, we haven't had anything like this. And people understand because they face the same levels of repression, because that police repression now is being used as a force of gentrification, much like it was used prior during urban renewal, right, as a hedge to contain Black encroachment on white communities. The inverse process is happening now. And I think that's why not only in Detroit, not only in Pontiac, not only in Flint, right, all across this country, you're seeing increased conflict with the police because they're in many ways in the service of capital rather than the people. I'll stop there.
Thank you both for those remarks. I want to remind our gallery that if you do have questions, to put those in the chat, and we will try to get to those questions as quickly as we can. Also, that we did have a password for those who are joining us today. If you know of folks who are still trying to get in, if you want to share that password with them so that they can join in the discussion as well. Also, I want to get back to that point about policing in the community, past decades to present. I think it's important to understand the historical context of policing communities as we think back to Black codes and vagrancy laws and sharecropping and all of those scenarios that, you know, brings about policing of various communities and what the impact is from past decades to present. I know we've talked about, you know, segregation in terms of where people are able to reside in education and politics, but what role specifically does the uprising of the 1967 and 1943 other riots as we look to examples of like Black Lives Matter protests today?
I would argue to you that there's some similarities certainly between 67 and today. Black people in the city of Detroit at that time were, you know, approaching a majority, but were still less than a majority. But their politics were, they felt like it was a colonial operation, right? That they had forced governance on the institutions that affected their daily lives. And the key struggle of the Black Power movement at that time was to gain community control over the forces that impacted your daily lives in your community, whether it was the police, whether it was the schools, whether it was the fire department, whether it was the welfare department, right? To have a say in kind of the policies and even kind of like in terms of education and what the curriculum would be that would best serve a group of people, right? And I think the occupying force, the police as an occupying force became a common theme in the 1960s. But I think also the same has been true more recently with gentrification, as we see kind of like cities as destination spots, as we see all this money going to the wealthy to redevelop elements of the city in a way that's very kind of similar to urban renewal, right? It's like taking existing areas in the downtown, building them up so the people who lived there prior can no longer live there, right? And almost to the point where today, taxes are so high that, you know, many of the inner ring suburbs that I talked to you about earlier, the people, working class and middle class people that lived in the city earlier took off, right? So 250,000 people left Detroit from 2000 to 2010 because they couldn't afford the taxes here anymore, right? Because they weren't getting abated, Dan Gilbert was. So they couldn't afford to be here anymore, right? Which forces depopulation. And so as part of that process of like trying to gentrify cities, part of it is also displacing the current and poor population, right? And I think we see that going on, and people see that in their communities, not only through kind of like cops on the beat, because they don't police like that, but what they call today community policing. And I want to be very clear on this because community policing sounds great, right? It uses a term community that we love, right? You want a community, whether you're at work or amongst your neighbors or whatever. Community policing in many ways is just a rebranded version of stop and frisk at this point, right? And what community policing suggests, at least euphemistically, is that like by building a better relationship between police and the community, police community relations will improve, right? But that obviously isn't the case. And you got to ask yourself this question, like in Detroit, where I live, community police now have damn near unmarked cars that are all black, and they mark themselves, they say DPD on them with black lettering, right? Well, if you're community police, right, shouldn't you have bells and whistles on your car so the community could run down the street to thank you for your service? Well, clearly they know that that's not the reality or what they're working with, right? And beyond that, we have all this surveillance, right? All these cameras, and the scope of which is really breathtaking at the state level. It's not just in the cities, it's all over, right? And people are aware of this, and people are upset about it, and people know that their areas are being hyper-policed. And we use statistics for this, right? I'll out my university, but Wayne State's Center for Urban Studies runs the Detroit Police CompStat program, right? Which is the basis of stop and frisk. Bratton in New York started this. They looked at crime statistics, and then they put police in those areas. Because if there's crime, then you preemptively will stop crime. Think about that too, preemptively stopping crime. That's a problem in and of itself, right? But I think most critically here is that, of course, we know that, poor people will try and, take care of themselves, right? Poverty breeds crime. So, and in this country, poverty has been racialized in large measure, right? So this becomes kind of like, we talked about de facto before. A de facto means to justify hyper-policing poor Black and Latino people in the city of Detroit, right? And all the strategies that are being implemented and throwing more money at gang prevention and guns and all these things doesn't do anything but incarcerate more people. And by incarcerating more people, you literally are taking citizens out of Detroit, placing them in rural areas, and increasing their representation in state voting, right? You're disenfranchising Detroit beyond kind of pulling the plugs on the voting machines or going up to TFC Center with 50 Karens, right? It's structured into this whole arrangement.
Yeah, I want to come back to a couple of the numbers that I used at the beginning of this discussion in terms of Pontiac. So once again, the median income in this city is $33,000, right? 100% of the students in the Pontiac school system are below the federal poverty line, 100%. I got that number from the former head of the school district, right? 100%. And I mentioned this in part, I want to underscore something David said in the kind of last segment when he was talking about his students and the mythology about leaving Detroit after 67, when in fact their parents and grandparents left Detroit much earlier than that. I mean, Thomas Segru has pretty much demolished the mythology that the depopulation of Detroit began after 67. It didn't. It began with the deindustrialization of Detroit in the 1950s. And what's been going on in Pontiac for the last 40 years, but intensified tremendously over the last 20, is the deindustrialization of Pontiac, really as an echo of Detroit. Pontiac has lost all of its not all, it's lost many of its most well-paying jobs. And certainly GM's presence, General Motors' presence is a pale echo of what it was. So the poverty in this community, there's no way to abate it until there are opportunities in this community. And right now, as I mentioned at the outset, much of Pontiac is stigmatized by surrounding Oakland County. So it's really hard to see where those opportunities are going to come from.
If I could just add to that, it's a very good point, but we oftentimes, like when we're talking about metropolitan Detroit race relations, right? Generally, one of the main topics that has always come up historically, certainly during the period of Coleman Young, but even more recently after bankruptcy, is this notion of regionalism, right? That we have to operate as a region, right? And share things. But the way this works out is often quite complicated, right? Because one of the demands that people were making when Bradley versus Milliken was filed was for regionalization, right? It was regionalization of public schools and access to a decent education. People in the suburbs wanted absolutely nothing to do with that, right? Meaning regionalization oftentimes only comes about when it benefits people in the suburbs, right? So we can regionalize the DIA and then you get a free pass by paying, a certain amount on your taxes. Or perhaps most importantly, right? Finally, after decades of trying to do it, right, regionalizing the water department. The suburbs never liked their rates, right? Even though that Detroit built up all the infrastructure to deliver them their water, right? But they meaning kind of like the forces of the state and the emergency manager brought that into play in a way that shows you kind of the, everybody's impacted by this, but how it becomes racialized. Brought it in play, I believe, solely to kind of like, rework and privatize the entire water system and to push forward what was the KWA, right? The Karangati Water Authority, which I think was doing some work in terms of providing water elsewhere and profiting off it, but that's a whole nother story. But meanwhile, Flint makes a shift to the Flint River in many ways because it breaks from Detroit's water system, right? And that's being done by emergency managers who are calling this, right? Even the city council votes against this. It's ultimately a guy, a Democrat, Andy Dillon, who's the treasurer, who will ultimately make this decision. And I believe that was done specifically to help pave the way to help privatize Detroit's water system as a whole. So think about all that the people of Flint suffered as a result of these machinations behind the scene. And I bring this up to tell you that I just got word the other day that a new version of emergency management laws are being floated in the state legislature currently. And these laws would have even less oversight than before. In fact, the way they're written would not allow you to FOIA representatives of emergency management. See, we were able to find out what happened to Flint before largely through having this kind of oversight. So instead of learning from that to prevent that from ever happening again, the solution now is to hide the materials of everybody working under emergency management. So if things go sideways again, nobody could be held accountable, right? And this fundamentally would never happen if we were talking about the water in Plymouth or the schools in West Bloomfield or Sterling Heights, right? So race relations are class relations too in this country. We have a system of racial capitalism. And if we're going to address any of this, right, we have to not deal with the relations, but the power relation, not the interpersonal relations, but the power relations.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go into that specific space there. But again, for those of you who are just joining us or just been here for a short period, we're joined today by panelists David Goldberg from Wayne State University and Graham Cassano from Oakland University. We have about 12 minutes or so remaining in our time today. I want to shift to ways in which we can address some of the things that we've talked about today. And so what factors or means, let's start at the university level, since you're both professors at the university. What can be done at the university level to address some of the areas that we've talked about today, perhaps with faculty or students, or as the university's role in the community? Talk a little bit about ways in which our efforts at the university can begin to address some of these disparities.
Well, I'm really glad to see Oakland University attempting to form a fruitful partnership with the Pontiac community. This has been a relationship that has been fraught in the past, and right now it's promising. And I'm not going to make any final judgment on how this relationship will work out, but it's very promising. What I would like to see, though, is a significant amount of money put into helping African-American students afford tuition. And that's what I think, again, I come back over and over again to the wealth gap, the legacy of white supremacy that produced this tremendous wealth gap between white Americans and Black Americans. And so one of the first things I want to see is more money for Black students at Oakland, at Wayne State, at Michigan State, at University of Michigan, at Eastern, at every public institution in Michigan.
I would agree fundamentally with that. I think, you know, all students should have more access. But I also understand kind of like the constraints that universities are made to feel by the state legislature. And I guess one of the things that I would argue, I've tried to make this argument at my school, I think we place so much emphasis on 4 to 6 year graduation rates in a way that is inherently classist and racist, right? Fundamentally, by appealing to graduating people in 4 to 6 years, you're dealing with people who are usually of a higher economic standing. They could attend school full time. And by focusing on that, like think about how little money we get from the state to make that big of a focus, right? We're a state funded institution, but I don't know about Oakland, but like it's less than 20% at my institution. My estimation, you'd be making a better play by doing what's fundamentally right, which is trying to provide more people with an opportunity and even foregoing that money if you had to, seeking donations, because I actually think you could make more than you'd receive from the state, and you'd be sending a message to the state that everybody needs access to education so we could deal with these discrepancies in income and in wealth, right, that we're talking about here. Now, I will also say too that I've worked at Wayne for a number of years. I work with a group called, there's a cheap plug, the General Baker Institute. We're located on Livernois, and we're just north of the Lodge. So come by anytime. But what I'm trying to do, and I say this to faculty members too, because we have a lot of ideas that, I'll get to that in a second. We have a lot of ideas that if we do good things for the community, poorer communities, that will help. I think more fundamentally, we teach a community school at General Baker Institute, and it's as much for our students to learn from people in Detroit who have these experiences as for us faculty members to learn from people, right? Rather than to just impose knowledge or what have you, but to really kind of, you know, understand that we live in a relatively isolated world and that we have a lot to learn from being engaged with people on a human level. And that to me is critically important. It's more important to me than like first year programs where you tell people about this and that and you spend a lot of money on it. If you're not going to walk somebody through 4 years and provide real mentorship, that first year program isn't going to do much. It's going to overburden people. I've witnessed this firsthand with my graduation and retention rates and my learning communities and things of this nature. And fundamentally, anybody who's involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion, a year isn't going to do it, right? You're dealing with deficits created by the structures that we're talking about. And kids, even if they're allowed in, and this is white kids too now, don't think like these suburban schools. I get kids from Birmingham that can't write, right? So the schools, we need to have a more nurturing environment. Students need more money, but we need more hands-on instruction to make up for this deficit. And it has to be more than 1 year. It has to be from entry to graduation. And it's going to cost money. And we can't run universities like a business. We have to run universities what they're for, which is for learning, inquiry, and we have to get rid of this kind of interpretation of the neoliberal model onto our public institutions.
Yeah, I just want to agree with everything David just said. I think, you know, we really need better mentorship, and we need to understand what the university mission is.
To Beth's point, Beth raised a question in the chat, and let me read it out loud for those of you that can't see it. She said, I want to clarify about the new emergency manager laws being developed, and I'll send someone a copy later so you guys can pass them around. Basically, if the potential laws had been in place a few years ago, the origins and wrongdoers of the Flint water crisis wouldn't have been uncovered. Are they presumably Republicans developing these laws as a direct response? From what I've heard from people that are up in Lansing, it's both Democrats and Republicans, right? And of course, what happened before in Flint was both Democrats and Republicans. Let's be clear about that, right? Snyder clearly was a Republican, and was privatizing things. But Andy Dillon, who's Mike Duggan's best friend, right, is a Democrat. Well, said to be a Democrat, right? And other people from Jeffrey Wright in the neighboring Genesee County was a Democrat as well. So I think what they're trying to do is cover their tracks, but let's be clear too, that we don't understand the full scope of what even happened in Flint, because people within the administration are protected because we don't have FOIA for government officials at that level. So we don't know directly the involvement of Snyder. We don't know directly the involvement of Andy Dillon because they were protected earlier.
So I see a question here from John Goodwin. What are some things that we as Metro Detroiters can do at a fundamental level to help? Because I'm guessing that coming downtown every once in a while to attend a game, concert, et cetera, isn't having the impact we think it is. So what real tangible ways can we help that are easy to suggest to our friends, family? Now, I can't speak to Detroit, and I'll let David speak to Detroit, but I want to repeat what I've said several times in this talk, which is that it's my perception, and I think there's a lot of empirical evidence that Pontiac as a city has been largely and unjustly, unfairly stigmatized by surrounding Oakland County. One of the ways that you can help remove that stigma is to come to Pontiac and participate. And I would say participate in voluntary organizations in Pontiac. There's a urban farming collective across the street from my house called the Micah 6 Collective. They have a little vegetable store where they provide low cost vegetables for the urban community, and they are always looking for volunteers. And that's one of a dozen different organizations that I can think of off the top of my head in Pontiac, where you can come and quite literally, if you want to be a farmer, get your hands dirty and begin to encounter and experience the community. And if you bring your children to encounter and experience the community and help begin the process of destigmatizing Pontiac, because the stigma is not just.
David, you have a response there?
I got a couple of minutes, I realize.
Okay.
Detroit is obviously equally stigmatized, but they've carved out a space for you to be able to come downtown or to Corktown, whatever. I have no problem with you coming to downtown or Corktown. I just suggest you stay a while and get involved with people that actually live in the city, because most of the people down there who are working there and who are benefiting from this aren't dealing with the problems that the rest of the city are. Right? Obviously support, whoever you want to support, you want to go to a game, great. But I would challenge you to kind of get involved, and not only get involved in the city itself, right? These same issues impact the suburbs, and they're going to have to get involved in a way that might be uncomfortable. We have a tremendously big problem with affordable housing, not only in the city, but the suburbs. And for those of us that have decent incomes, whether we're in cities or suburbs, it's incumbent upon us to make sure that housing is made affordable in our areas for everybody.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest struggles in Pontiac right now is I think it's vitally important that we have affordable housing. And I think that's something that we need both community members, but also the state's cooperation in really bringing affordable housing to Pontiac.
Well, I want to say thank you to you both, David and Graham, for joining us today on this panel discussion, race relations in Metro Detroit, past decades to the present. We have maybe less than a minute left. If you want to, give a 20 seconds of, what can be done or something that was not already added so that we can go ahead and close out, but I want to give you the final word there.
I just want to say thank you for bringing this discussion together. I think I've already made some suggestions about some of the things that need to be done. Some of them we can do, some of them, like breaking down the wealth gap between racial groups in this country, are bigger than individuals, but we can begin to think about how to do that. Yeah,
I'll just echo that. It's a pleasure for me to be with you today. I love coming to Oakland, and I thank you for the invitation. And I'm available. We have tons of opportunities for people that want to do volunteer work or get involved in organizations. feel free to contact me at my email. You could find me at Wayne's site for African American Studies, and I'll respond accordingly.
All right,
Great, thank
again.
you.
And I see that you dropped in the chat the emergency management document for anyone who wanted to view that. I appreciate the time today, and thank you, Ann, for allowing me to moderate this discussion. I'll turn it back over to you, Ann.
Thank you to everybody who participated, joined today. Thank you so much to our panelists and our moderator. This was great. And we hope you have a good, stay safe in the snow out there. Take care.
Thank you all. And just one reminder, we still have several events here at Oakland University celebrating the month. So please join us at future events as we celebrate here at Oakland University. Thank you again.
Yes.
I hope these people aren't like my students.